November 1st, 1943, over Wilhelmshaven, Germany. A B-17 Flying Fortress collides head-on with a German Messerschmitt Bf-19 at 20,000 feet. The impact is catastrophic. The entire tail section of the bomber is nearly severed, hanging by threads of metal. The rear gunner is gone. The vertical stabilizer is destroyed. Every control surface that keeps an aircraft stable is either missing or shredded. And yet somehow the pilot manages to fly this broken, dying machine 250 miles back across the North Sea to England. 6 crew members walk away. This is the story of the B-17 known as All-American, and the impossible flight that defied every law of aeronautics and common sense. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress earned its legendary reputation not through speed or firepower, but through sheer toughness. Introduced in 1938, the B-17 was designed as a high-altitude strategic bomber capable of defending itself with an array of 50-caliber machine guns positioned throughout the aircraft. By 1943, the B-17G variant carried up to 13 guns and a crew of 10 men. The aircraft's 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines could push it to altitudes above 35,000 feet and give it a maximum speed of around 287 miles per hour. But what truly set the B-17 apart was its rugged construction. The aircraft featured redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a structural design that could absorb tremendous punishment and still bring crews home. Stories of B-17s returning with massive damage became commonplace in the 8th Air Force. Aircraft limped back with engines shot out, wings punctured with hundreds of flak holes, and entire sections of fuselage blown away. But even among these incredible tales of survival, what happened to All-American stands completely apart. On the morning of November 1st, 1943, the 414th Bombardment Squadron of the 97th Bombardment Group prepared for a mission against German targets in Wilhelmshaven, a major naval base on Germany's northern coast. German flak batteries ringed the port facilities, and Luftwaffe fighter squadrons operated from nearby airfields. Any bomber crew heading to Wilhelmshaven knew they were in for a fight. The pilot of All-American that day was Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr., a 23-year-old from Maryland. Bragg had already flown multiple combat missions and earned a reputation as a steady, competent pilot. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel. The rest of the 10-man crew included Navigator Second Lieutenant Alva Duran, Bombardier Second Lieutenant John D. Calasar McIlavoy, Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Lloyd Jennings, Radio Operator Technical Sergeant James McAloney, Ball Turret Gunner Staff Sergeant Elton Conda, Waist Gunner Staff Sergeant Michael Zook, Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Samuel Sarpolis, and another waist gunner whose name records have preserved less clearly. These men had trained together, flown together, and trusted each other completely. They would need every ounce of that trust in the hours ahead. The mission briefing was straightforward. The 97th Bomb Group would join a larger formation of B-17s, attacking Wilhelmshaven's U-boat pens and industrial facilities. The bombers would fly in tight combat box formations, designed to maximize defensive firepower against German fighters. Each B-17 would cover the blind spots of the aircraft around it. The formation would climb to bombing altitude, make the bomb run, and then return to England. Intelligence warned that German fighter opposition would be heavy. The Luftwaffe had been bloodied over the past months, but they remained dangerous and determined. Their tactics had evolved. Rather than attacking from the rear where bomber defensive fire was heaviest, German fighters increasingly made head-on passes, exploiting the B-17's relatively weak forward armament. These attacks were terrifying for bomber crews. A Messerschmitt Bf-109, or Focke-Wulf FW-1090, closing head-on at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour, gave gunners only seconds to aim and fire. If the fighter didn't break off, collision became a real possibility. All-American lifted off from its base in North Africa, where the 97th Bomb Group was stationed at the time, forming up with the rest of the squadron. The bombers climbed steadily, their oxygen systems kicking in as they passed through. At altitude, temperatures inside the aircraft dropped well below zero. Crew members wore electrically heated suits, but the cold still penetrated. Frost formed on metal surfaces. Breath crystallized instantly. The men checked their equipment, tested their guns, and scanned the sky for the first signs of enemy fighters. The formation crossed the European coast and continued toward the target. German radar tracked their approach, Air raid sirens wailed in Wilhelmshaven. Flak batteries swung their guns skyward. Luftwaffe fighters. The bomb run over Wilhelmshaven was chaotic. Black clouds of flak burst around the formation, each explosion sending thousands of jagged steel fragments through the air. The bombers held steady. Bomb bay doors open, bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites. All-American released its payload on target. Secondary explosions bloomed below as bombs struck ammunition. Then the formation turned for home, and the German fighters hit them. Bf-109s slashed through the bomber formation, 20 cannons blazing. The B-17s returned fire, their .50 caliber guns hammering out streams of tracers. Spent shell casings littered the floors of the bombers. The smell of cordite filled the cramped fuselages. Radio chatter was. Pilots called out fighter positions. Gunners shouted warnings. Aircraft reported damage. One bomber in the formation took a direct flak hit and exploded, killing all 10 men aboard instantly. Another spiraled downward, trailing smoke, crew members bailing out as the aircraft fell. All-American had so far escaped serious damage, but that was about to change in the most catastrophic way imaginable. A Bf-109, flown by a pilot whose name has been lost to history, made a head-on attack run. The fighter came in fast and steep, nose guns firing, tracers zipped past All-American's cockpit. Lieutenant Bragg held the bomber steady, trusting his gunners to drive the fighter off. The top turret gunner opened fire. So did the cheek gunners in the know. The Bf-109 was supposed to break off. German pilots were trained to make their firing pass and then dive away before collision became likely. But something went wrong. Either the German pilot misjudged his closing speed, or battle damage affected his controls, or perhaps he was already dead from return fire and his aircraft simply continued on its terminal trajectory. Whatever the reason, the Bf-109 didn't break away. It smashed directly into All-American's tail section. The collision happened at over 250 miles per hour. The Bf-109 hit just forward of the tail gunner's position with the force of a bomb. Metal shrieked, rivets sheared. The entire tail section of All-American was nearly severed from the rest of the fuselage. The impact killed tail gunner Staff Sergeant Samuel Sarpolis instantly. The Bf-109 disintegrated, its wreckage tumbling away toward the ground far below. But the damage to All-American was almost beyond comprehension. The vertical stabilizer, the large fin that rises from the tail and provides directional stability, was completely destroyed. The horizontal stabilizers, the smaller wing-like surfaces at the tail that control pitch, were mangled and barely attached. The entire rear fuselage was split open and twisted, held together only by a few structural spars and control cables. Daylight poured through gaping holes. The tail section hung at an angle, drooping downward, held on by what looked like nothing more than hope and a few strands of metal. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Bragg felt the aircraft lurch violently. The control yoke went nearly dead in his hands. All-American immediately started to pitch and yaw erratically. Without the tail surfaces providing stability, the bomber became almost uncontrollable. Bragg fought the yoke, trying to keep the nose level. Co-pilot Engel grabbed his own controls and added his strength. The two pilots wrestled with the aircraft, their muscles straining. Behind them, the intercom erupted with shouts. Crew members in the rear had felt the impact and seen the damage. The waist gunners stared in horror at the tail section, which looked like it could tear completely away at any second. Wind screamed through the shattered fuselage. Loose debris whipped through the interior. The temperature, already far below zero, plummeted even further as freezing air blasted through the openings. Lieutenant Bragg's first thought was to give the bailout order. Standard procedure when an aircraft was crippled this badly was to abandon it immediately. A B-17 without tail control was not supposed to be flyable. The aircraft should have entered an uncontrollable spin and broken apart. Every pilot knew this. Every training manual said so. Bragg reached for the bailout bell button, ready to send the signal that would send his crew tumbling out into the frigid sky. But then something made him hesitate. The aircraft was still flying. Barely, but flying. The engines were still running. The wings were intact. If he ordered a bailout over German-occupied territory, his crew would parachute into enemy hands. Those who survived the jump would spend the rest of the war in prison camps, and some might not survive at all. German civilians had been known to attack Allied airmen before German military authorities could take them into custody. Bailout over the North Sea wasn't much better. The water temperature in November would kill a man in minutes. Bragg made a decision that was either incredibly brave or completely insane. He would try to fly All-American home. The rest of the crew watched in disbelief as Bragg and Engel fought to stabilize the aircraft. Slowly, agonizingly, the pilots found that by using differential engine power and extremely careful control inputs, they could keep the bomber more or less level. It wasn't really flying in any normal sense. It was more like controlled falling. The B-17 wanted to tumble. Aerodynamic forces that normally cancelled each other out were now completely unbalanced. But by constantly adjusting throttles and trim, Bragg discovered he could maintain some semblance of control. The aircraft wouldn't respond quickly. Any sudden movement threatened to send it into a death spiral, but gentle, smooth inputs produced gentle, barely adequate responses. It would have to be enough. Bragg's immediate problem was altitude. All-American was losing height steadily. With the tail damage creating massive drag and disrupting airflow, the bomber couldn't maintain level flight. They were descending at about 500 feet per minute. At that rate, they had maybe 30 minutes before they hit the ocean. Bragg couldn't climb. Every attempt to raise the nose threatened to stall the aircraft, and a stall without functioning tail controls would be instantly fatal. So he accepted the descent and focused on a new goal: get out over the North Sea. Get as far from the German coast as every mile they flew west was a mile closer to England and a mile further from enemy territory. The formation of B-17s that All-American had been flying with was long gone. The other bombers had continued on course toward England, unaware at first that All-American had dropped out. Bragg and his crew were alone in hostile skies. The crew worked desperately to keep their dying aircraft in the air. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Lloyd Jennings moved through the shattered fuselage, assessing damage and trying to stabilize the tail section. What he saw was terrifying. The tail was attached by only a few structural members. Control cables that ran from the cockpit to the tail surfaces were severed or badly frayed. Hydraulic lines were cut. The entire rear of the aircraft flexed and twisted with every air current. Jennings could see straight through the fuselage to the sky outside. He reported to Bragg that the tail could separate completely at any moment. There was nothing they could do to prevent it. If it happened, the aircraft would tuck. All they could do was fly as smoothly as possible, avoid any turbulence or sudden maneuvers, and pray. The waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Michael Zook and his companion, used spare steel cables and any materials they could find to try to reinforce the tail section. They wrapped cables around structural members and pulled them tight, essentially trying to lash the tail to the fuselage. It was crude field engineering under the worst possible conditions. The men worked without parachutes on, knowing that if the tail let go while they were back there, they'd have no time to clip on their chutes and bail out. But they worked anyway, because it was their only chance. Every cable they secured might buy a few more minutes. Every reinforcement might hold the aircraft together just a little bit longer. Navigator Second Lieutenant Alva Geron plotted the course home. Normally this would be straightforward, but All-American could barely maneuver. Bragg couldn't make sharp turns. He could only coax the aircraft through the gentlest of course corrections. Geron calculated a route that involved the shallowest possible turns and the most direct line towards England. He passed heading corrections to Bragg, who implemented them with the patience of a man defusing a bomb. 5 degrees left. Wait. Steady. 5 degrees right. Wait. Steady. It was exhausting, nerve-shredding work. One mistake, one moment of impatience, and the aircraft would depart controlled flight and kill them all. Meanwhile, the aircraft continued to descend. 20,000 feet became 15,000, 15 became 10. Bragg couldn't stop it. The best he could do was slow the rate of descent by carefully managing airspeed and engine power. Too fast and the increased aerodynamic forces might rip the tail off. Too slow, and the aircraft would stall. Bragg flew right on the edge, threading a needle through a constantly shifting window of survivable airspeeds. His arms ached, his hands cramped. Sweat froze on his face despite the cold. Co-pilot Engel spelled him occasionally, taking the controls for brief periods, but Bragg insisted on flying most of the way himself. He knew the aircraft's quirks now. He knew exactly how much control input it could tolerate. He didn't trust anyone else to have that same feel. The crew threw everything they could out of the aircraft to reduce weight. Ammunition cans went first, then the heavy .50 caliber machine guns themselves, oxygen bottles, toolkits. Everything that wasn't bolted down and some things that were. Every pound they shed meant slightly better performance, slightly slower descent. The ball turret gunner Staff Sergeant Elton Conda even considered jettisoning the ball turret itself, but it was too integrated into the aircraft structure to remove in flight, so they left it and continued dumping everything else. The B-17 shed equipment like a wounded animal shedding blood, desperate to stay alive just a little longer. 10,000 feet became 5,000. The North Sea stretched below them, cold and grey and merciless. Bragg could see whitecaps on the waves. If they went down in that water, survival time would be measured in minutes. The crew donned their life vests. They prepared the life rafts. Radio-operated Technical Sergeant James McCaloney sent distress signals, broadcasting their position and situation. He received acknowledgements from Allied bases. Rescue aircraft were being scrambled. Air-sea rescue boats were being alerted. But everyone knew that rescue in these conditions was a long shot. If all American hit the water, the cold would kill the crew long before rescue arrived. 5,000 feet became 3,000. England was still miles away. The crew could see the coastline now, a thin, dark line on the horizon, so close, but the aircraft was still descending. Bragg ran the calculations in his head. They weren't going to make it to an airfield. The best he could hope for was to reach land, any land. A crash landing on English soil was infinitely preferable to ditching in the ocean. He aimed for the coast and nursed every last bit of performance from the dying bomber. The engines roared. The propellers clawed at the air. The shattered tail section groaned and flexed, but somehow, impossibly, stayed attached. 3,000 feet became 1,000. The English coast slid beneath them. They'd made it to land. The crew felt a surge of relief, but it was premature. They still had to land this wreck, and landing would be the most dangerous part of the entire ordeal. Bragg couldn't lower the landing gear. The hydraulic systems were destroyed. He'd have to belly land. He couldn't use flaps to slow down. Those systems were also gone. He couldn't make a normal approach. Any kind of banking turn might rip the tail off. His options were brutal and simple. Find a long, flat piece of ground, point the aircraft at it, and put it down as gently as possible. One chance. No margin for error. Bragg spotted an airfield ahead. RAF Predanach in Cornwall. He radioed ahead and informed the tower that he was coming in for an emergency landing. The tower cleared all other aircraft out of the area and sounded the crash alarms. Fire trucks and ambulances raced to positions along the runway. Ground crews stared up at All American as it approached and couldn't believe what they were seeing. The tail section looked like it was barely attached. The aircraft was clearly yet here it was, somehow still in the air, limping toward the runway like a wounded bird desperate to reach its nest. Bragg lined up on final approach. 500 feet, 400, 300. The aircraft was descending fast, too fast, but he had no way to slow it further. 200 feet, 100. The ground rushed up. Bragg pulled back gently on the yoke, flaring the nose just slightly. The aircraft settled. The belly touched the runway. Metal screamed as the fuselage scraped along the concrete. Sparks flew in great rooster tails behind the aircraft. The B-17 slid and slid and slid, friction gradually bleeding away its momentum. The nose dug in slightly, then bounced up. The aircraft slewed to the left. Bragg fought it straight with engine. The slide continued for what felt like forever, and then, finally, All American came to rest. For a moment, there was silence inside the cockpit. Bragg and Engel stared at each other, barely comprehending that they were still alive. Then the silence shattered as the rest of the crew began shouting and cheering. They'd made it. Against all odds, against every rule of physics and aviation, they'd brought the broken aircraft home. The crew evacuated quickly, piling out through hatches and climbing down onto the solid, blessed ground of England. Fire crews surrounded the aircraft, but there was no fire. Medical personnel rushed forward, but aside from minor cuts and bruises and the psychological shock of what they'd just endured, the crew was largely unhurt. 6 men had walked away from an aircraft that by all rights should have killed them over Germany. Ground crews and engineering officers swarmed over All American as soon as it was declared safe. What they found astonished them. The tail section was held on by literally a few structural members. If 1 or 2 more had failed, the entire tail would have separated. The control cables were frayed down to their last strands. The vertical stabilizer was completely gone. The horizontal stabilizers were mangled beyond recognition. The fuselage was split open over a length of several feet. Daylight was visible straight through the aircraft. Engineers examined the wreckage and issued their professional assessment. This aircraft should not have been flyable. There was no technical reason it should have stayed in the air. The fact that Lieutenant Bragg had flown at 250 miles and landed it safely was beyond their understanding. Photographs were taken of All-American from every angle. The images are striking even today. The most famous photo shows the aircraft from the rear quarter, clearly displaying the massive damage to the tail section. The tail looks like it's attached with tape and prayer. Another photo shows crew members standing next to the wreckage, pointing at the damage, their expressions mixing disbelief with pride. These photographs were widely distributed for propaganda purposes. They became symbols of American determination and the legendary toughness of the B-17 Flying Fortress. Posters featuring All-American appeared in factories and recruitment offices. The message was clear. American aircraft could take unimaginable punishment and still bring their crews home. American airmen possessed courage and skill that could overcome any obstacle. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr. was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions that day. The citation praised his extraordinary piloting skill and his decision to attempt the impossible rather than abandon his aircraft and crew. Co-pilot Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel received the Air Medal. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Lloyd Jennings and the waist gunners who worked to stabilize the tail section also received commendations. The entire crew was recognized for their bravery and their teamwork under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. But for Bragg and his men, the real reward was simpler. They were alive. They'd walked away. They'd beaten the odds. All-American itself was declared beyond repair. The damage was simply too extensive. The aircraft was stripped of usable parts and eventually scrapped. But its story lived on. Aviation engineers studied the wreckage and the flight data, trying to understand how it had remained airborne. The incident contributed to ongoing research into aircraft survivability and damage tolerance. It reinforced design principles about redundancy and structural strength. Future aircraft benefited from the lessons learned from All-American's impossible flight. The incident also became part of bomber crew lore. Throughout the rest of the war, crews told and retold the story of the B-17 that flew without a tail. It became a source of hope. If All-American could make it home after a mid-air collision, then maybe any damaged bomber could make it. Maybe no situation was truly hopeless. The story of All-American also highlighted the incredible toughness of the B-17 design. Boeing's engineers had built into the aircraft a level of structural integrity that exceeded even their own expectations. The B-17 could absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft. Hundreds of other B-17s came home with massive battle damage during the war. Bombers landed with engines shot out, wings full of holes, entire sections of fuselage blown away. One famous B-17 landed safely after a German fighter became lodged in its wing. Another flew home with its nose blown off. The B-17's reputation for bringing crews home became one of its greatest assets. Crews trusted the aircraft. They knew it would protect them. That trust translated into morale and effectiveness. After the war, Lieutenant Bragg returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke publicly about his experience, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. Other crew members went on to various careers, carrying with them the bond forged in that crucible over the North Sea. They had faced death together and emerged victorious through skill, courage, and no small amount of luck. Staff Sergeant Samuel Sarpolis, the tail gunner killed in the initial collision, was buried with full military honors. His sacrifice was remembered by his surviving crewmates for the rest of their lives. The mission over Wilhelmshaven cost the 97th Bomb Group several aircraft and dozens of men. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe would continue for another year and a half, costing tens of thousands more lives. But All-American's story provided a counterpoint to the grim statistics. It showed that survival was possible even in the most desperate circumstances. Today, All-American is remembered as one of the most remarkable survival stories of World War II. The photographs of the damaged aircraft are among the most iconic images of the air war over Europe. Aviation museums display models of All-American showing its battle damage. Historians cite the incident as an example of exceptional airmanship under extreme pressure. Documentaries and books recount the story for new generations, and the lesson endures. Never give up. Even when every instrument, every training manual, every expert says the situation is hopeless, there might still be a way through. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr. and his crew proved that. They took an aircraft that should have fallen from the sky and flew at 250 miles home. They looked at impossible odds, and decided to try anyway. The broader context of the strategic bombing campaign makes all Americans' achievement even more significant. By late 1943, the Allied air forces were suffering devastating losses over Germany. 8th Air Force bomber crews faced a statistical reality that was almost unthinkable. Early in the campaign, crew members had only about a 1 in 4 chance of surviving their required 25-mission tour. Aircraft losses on some missions exceeded 20%. Entire bomb groups could be wiped out in a single day. Yet the men kept flying. They climbed into their aircraft knowing the odds were against them, knowing that statistically they probably wouldn't survive the war, and they flew anyway. Stories like All American mattered because they gave those men hope. They proved that skill and determination could make a difference. They showed that sometimes, against all logic, the impossible could become possible. The technical lessons learned from incidents like All American influenced post-war aircraft design significantly. Engineers understood that aircraft needed to be designed not just for optimal performance, but for survivability under battle damage. Redundant systems became standard. Structural design incorporated damage tolerance principles. Flight control systems evolved to provide continued functionality even when primary systems were destroyed. The modern concept of fly-by-wire systems with multiple redundancies traces its lineage back to hard lessons learned in World War II. Every transport aircraft, every commercial airliner, every military jet flying today incorporates safety principles that were forged in the skies over Europe when damaged bombers limped home against all odds. For the families of the crew members, All Americans' survival meant everything. 6 families received their loved ones back, instead of receiving telegrams of condolence. 6 mothers and fathers, wives and children, got to embrace men who by all rights should have died over Germany. The emotional toll of the war cannot be quantified in statistics or strategic analyses. It lived in the hearts of families waiting for news, in the dread that accompanied every mission, in the relief when their men came home. All American delivered that relief to 6 families who might otherwise have spent the rest of their lives mourning. The story also serves as a reminder of the human cost of war. For all the remarkable courage and skill displayed by Lieutenant Bragg and his crew, one man, Staff Sergeant Samuel Tailless, paid the ultimate price. His family received no miracle. He died doing his duty in service to his country, but he died nonetheless. The celebration of survival must always be tempered with remembrance of every mission, even those that end successfully, carries a cost. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe eventually helped bring about Germany's defeat, but at a terrible price. Over 350,000 Allied airmen died. Countless more were wounded or taken prisoner. German civilian casualties from bombing numbered in the hundreds of thousands. War's arithmetic is always brutal, yet within that brutality, moments of transcendent courage shine through. Lieutenant Bragg's decision to fly All American home stands as one of those moments. He could have chosen the safer path. He could have ordered the bailout and accepted capture or death as the price of war. Instead, he chose to fight for survival. He chose to believe that the impossible might be possible. His crew chose to trust him, to work together, to do whatever was necessary to keep their broken aircraft in the air. That collective determination, that refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain, represents the best of human nature under pressure. It's the quality that allowed the Allied powers to ultimately prevail in World War II. It's the quality that built the peace that followed. It's the quality that still inspires us today when we face our own impossible challenges. So what do you think? If you were in Lieutenant Bragg's position, with your aircraft shattered and your crew looking to you for leadership, would you have tried to fly home or would you have ordered the bailout? It's easy to judge from safety and distance, but in that moment, with seconds to decide and lives hanging in the balance, what would you have done? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more forgotten stories of courage from World War II, stories of men who faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Next time, we'll uncover the story of the B-24 that flew 400 miles home with its nose blown completely off, and the bombardier who somehow survived inside it. These stories deserve to be remembered. These men deserve to be honored. Thank you for watching.